All right, so here's video 3, the last one for Wednesday's class. In this video, I'm going to put together arrays and for loops because, as I was saying at the end of video 2, those two structures or aspects of programming go together like hand in glove. They're such an important pairing when you're starting to deal with organized lists of data, such as the data streaming from the 12 inputs in the touch sensor. So what I'm going to do right now is code from beginning to scratch an array with 5 of your names assigned to it, and then a for loop that loops through and prints the values from each of the rows in that array, meaning your names, to the console. So if my goal here is to print a few of your names to the message console, which is not a really interesting program, but nonetheless is what I want to do. Well, breaking that down in terms of the tasks and the kind of the step-by-step way in which that needs to be done, first I'll create the array. And since I'm going to be dealing with names which are text, that's going to be a string array. So I'm going to declare this outside of the setup or draw functions because that makes the array global, meaning it can be used anywhere at any point in the sketch. And setup is a great place in which to initialize and or assign values to variables that you've created globally. So now I'm going to go ahead and create the array, and the first thing I'm going to do is tell processing, hey, this is a new string array and it's going to have 5 slots in it, or 5 rows or 5 drawers. I hope all those different metaphors aren't getting confusing. And then I'm going to indent in. And what I sometimes do when I have to write a bunch of the same kind of code over and over again is I'll write kind of a shell of it. And copy and paste. And then start filling in the details. So there's going to be row 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4. My array has 5 rows in it, and since the computer starts counting from 0, it's going to be 0 through 4. And then I'm going to go ahead and put in some names. Boy, let me see if I can remember some of them. I'll put in a couple of other people who come to mind. So here's the array. It's finished. It has values assigned to it. I've created a 5-row array. It has a name. It's data typed for string values, which are text. And I've assigned text values, names, to each of the 5 rows, 0 through 4. So that is the first big step. And when I'm working on code, when I'm working on projects, oftentimes what I like to do is make sure that each kind of piece in the puzzle, so to speak, is working before I get too far into it. Like, I just want to make sure that what I'm writing is working, so that if I get an error, at least I know that all of my code up to a specific point was working. So I'm already kind of minimizing the scope of where I would need to look for a mistake. So just to make sure this array was correctly put together, if I wanted to publish Jamie's name to the console, Yep. Since that's working, I can assume that everything here is working. So let me stop things for just a second before I put the for loop together, because there's something that I need to explain to you quickly, and I'll spend a little more time on it on Wednesday. When you're working with the code in a language like processing, which is an object-oriented language, at least implicitly, everything with which you're working is an object. And what that means for our purposes is the following. Objects in an object-oriented language, all objects, any objects, have methods and properties associated with them, verbs and nouns. Okay, so when you're working with an array, you want to learn about the different methods and properties that are associated with it. And the point that I'm trying to get at, in case that's not fully clear, it will be on Wednesday, is that we have access to a property whenever we're working with arrays called length. What length does is it allows us to find out the overall length of an array. So it's easy enough for me to look at the code that's written here and see, oh yeah, okay, it's 5 rows long. But what if I generated the array dynamically, or what if it's growing and shrinking as the program runs? Or I just, I might add more values to it at some point, and so I don't want to hard code in a length number that might change, which means I then have to chase down all the lines of my code in which I've, put this specific number in that's no longer valid. So there's a property associated with any array that you create called length. And length, like mouse x, like mouse y, like width, like height, it is basically a variable that is going to have the value of, in this case, the length of the array. So if I put students.length into the println method and hit run, I get the number 5 here in the console. 5, 0 through 4. I wanted to mention that because being able to use the length property in iterative structures like a for loop is incredibly important and very useful. Okay, let's get back on track here. I've created my array. Now I want to create a for loop that loops through the values in that array. That's where the rubber meets the road, so to speak. That's where the hand and the glove come together. So let me go ahead and create a for loop. I'm going to declare a counter variable that's data typed as an integer. I'm going to give it a value of 0. I'm going to say that as long as counter is smaller than 5, keep running. And I want it to count up by 1. So what do I write inside the opening and closing curly braces of my for loop in order to print to the console the 5 names that I just typed in above? That should do it. Let me go ahead and run this, and then I'll explain it. So you can see that it published all 5 names as listed in order to the console. Why did it do that? Well, I created a variable, an integer, data typed variable, created a variable that had a starting value of 0, which is the starting value of any array that I'm going to create. And then I wrote in the for loop that I want to iterate through, I want to loop at a speed of +1. So starting from 0, it's going to go from 0 to 1, 2, 3, 4, etc. And the if conditional that's basically here in between these two semicolons, so long as the value of counter is smaller than 5, do the stuff in the curly braces. Well, initially it's 0, so it's going to go ahead and print the value that's basically implied here to the console. And as it goes up by 1 to 1, 2, 3, 4, we get Allie, Alicia, Jamie, Aaron. So what is going on here? Well, remember that if I want to access one of the rows in an array, I put a number in there, 0, 1, 3. But I can also put a variable in there, a container that has a value in it. And counter has 5 possible values associated with it based on the way the for loop is written. 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4. When it gets to 5, 5 is not smaller than 5. And so it's never going to get that high. When I type in students and inside the opening and closing square brackets, I put the variable counter, as the for loop runs and it adds 1 to the value of counter, what the for loop ends up doing is printing the value of the next row to the console. That's where the for loop and an array structure really show their worth, is in your ability to loop through, in this case 5, but it could be literally hundreds or thousands of values in an array in a really fast, efficient way. Now, I want to say that I know that everything I've put together for you in these 3 videos is just a lot to process, but this is really about as hard as it's going to get. You're going to learn more stuff after this to help you do some really cool stuff at the midterm, but I would say that the for loop and the array and putting those 2 things together, being able to really understand that and own it, internalize it to the point where you really can use it, it's going to be the hardest thing you will have done this semester. So, you know, if traditionally the hard part of a semester is toward the end, one of the nice things about this course is that the hard part is right now when you're still fresh and you've got a little bit more headspace, because the other courses that you're taking aren't all demanding the same high level of work from you. So go all in on this, understand it, try creating a few arrays, and now try to create a few for loops that will iterate through them in different ways. And these examples of publishing stuff to the console, I know are just literally academic. Like they're just exercises. But to show you the quote-unquote real-world value of these kinds of concepts would require more code and complicate things before they need to be. Right now, I just want to make sure you understand the basic structures of these things. But if it helps to get a sense of like where you can start to go with just some really basic concepts like these in terms of creativity, rhetorical, effect, etc., I thought, you know, and I'll just go ahead and show you this project I did a few years ago. I went ahead around Raleigh and I took pictures. I took 26 pictures around town, and each picture was supposed to be associated in some way with a letter of the alphabet. So A was the Alpha Kappa Alpha sorority over at St. Aug's. B was the NC State Bell Tower. And here's the original picture, and I'll explain what's going on here in a second. C is the church over Hayes Barton Baptist. Dick's 306, moving around. Nicholson's Barbershop downtown. The Gettysburg graves over in the Oakwood Cemetery. So I took a photograph of each of these places, And then what I did is I found some text that seemed relevant to each of those locations or to the word itself. And so, for example, with the Gettysburg Graves, I went ahead and took the Gettysburg Address by Lincoln, and using a couple of for loops, I recreated the image in text by iterating over and over again through the entire length of the Gettysburg Address. So if you look closely here, you'll literally see the Gettysburg Address written over and over and over again. Well, how was I able to do that? That's just some pretty basic work with for loops and arrays. If you think about an image, it's basically a two-dimensional array. It's just a whole bunch of pixels in rows and columns. And the way that you access any particular pixel, you know, the sixth pixel in the 5th row, or the 233rd pixel in the 39th row, is with the slots of an array. And if I replace the pixel with a letter and then colorize that letter with the color of that pixel, well, then I'm recreating the image textually. So just using for loops and arrays, you can do some pretty interesting stuff with things that are structured in an array style format, like images, or most anything that you're going to be working with in terms of multimedia. So I know this example isn't exactly something you're going to be doing in art class, although you could, in a way, if you want it to be dynamic and flowing based on interactions with the touch interface you create. But the point I'm trying to get at is it's really worth focusing on arrays and for loops and understanding enough about them that you can use them creatively, because they're going to be an engine for creativity on so many levels, with the midterm, the final, with most any project that you would do in a computational context. All right, so that is it. I will see you guys on Wednesday.